Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lecture today. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I am the holder of the Baha'i Chair for World Peace. And it's really a pleasure today for me to have as our speaker, who will be introduced in a minute, Dr. Jonathan Pinckney. And I can't wait to hear what he has to tell us about the research that he's engaged in. So very warm welcome to you. I also wanted to thank some people who have made this event possible today, notably the BSOS ambassadors. Are they here? If you just stand, please. And thank you so much for your assistance with this event. Dr. Kate Seaman, please raise your hand in the back, and next to her, Ernesto Hawkins from the Baha'i Chair Office, as well as Emily. I'm right here. Where are you? Right here, taking photos. Emily, who is our student intern. So today's talk is under one of our 5 themes, which is on globalization and governance. And the Baha'i Chair is extremely interested in learning more about, I guess, approaches around the world that look to more nonviolent ways of accomplishing solutions to a better life for people. And I think today's lecture will help us to learn more in this important theme that we always are interested in learning more about. But first, to have you, the speaker introduced to you by a member. And the reason we have Dr. Pinckney with us today is because Dr. Maciej Bartkowski of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict actually sent us an email and said, would you be interested in him giving a talk? And of course we were delighted to receive the email. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Bartkowski, who is the Senior Director for Education and Research at the ICNC, to do the introduction. Just to tell you a little bit about him, he joined the ICNC in 2009, and prior to that he held a managerial and teaching positions at Adelphi University and Bard College. He has written edited a book on recovering nonviolent history, civil resistance in liberation struggles and nation building, a very interesting book published in 2013. So please welcome Dr. Bartkowski to the podium, who will then introduce our speaker, Dr. Pinckney.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank first the Baha'i Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland, and particularly its head, Professor Hoda Mahmoudi, and her staff for organizing this event, for hosting this event. So my name is Maciej Bartkowski. I'm Senior Director at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And before I introduce to you Dr. Pinckney, I would like to say a few words about my center and what we do. We are based in Washington, D.C. We are a private operating foundation that develops knowledge and shares that knowledge with various constituents. And we develop and share knowledge on nonviolent movements, on civil resistance, on nonviolent resistance strategies and tactics. And the recipients that are interested in that type of knowledge are activists, organizers, educators. They are also academic community and policy community. And as part of our educational mission, we support development of curricula and courses on civil resistance. And we publish various types of research as part of our special report series and monograph series. And we support young scholars who are interested in the subject of nonviolent movements, interested in doing research on that topic. And in fact, Jonathan Pinckney was one of our fellows who wrote two monographs, one of which he will be presenting here to you. And the other one was a monograph on breaking and making nonviolent discipline that produced an interesting finding that we could take and we are taking to activists and organizers to discuss with them how they can maintain nonviolent discipline when they organize movement and campaign, while, for example, at the same time facing severe repression from their opponents. And oftentimes we see that movements or campaigns would not be able to maintain nonviolent discipline for various reasons. So we use Jonathan's research and findings to better inform basically the practice of nonviolent resistance in the field. So I have great privilege to introduce to you today's speaker, my colleague, Dr. Jonathan Pittman. And although he will not admit to it because he is a modest and humble man, but Jonathan is really a rising star in scholarly circles that are studying civil resistance, that are doing research on nonviolent movements and on nonviolent resistance strategies. He is by now a leading scholar, a leading expert on the impact of nonviolent movements, nonviolent campaigns on democratization, and the impact of grassroots mobilization on democratic consolidation. So something that he will be sharing with you during this lecture. And I have known Jonathan for 5 years actually by now. I remember well how we got in touch. I had a number of burning questions with regard to civil resistance, with regard to nonviolent movements and the impact of nonviolent movements on political change. And I approached his mentor, a kind of prominent scholar on civil resistance, Erika Chenoweth, and I asked her, there are my questions here, could you give me the answer? And she said, no, unfortunately I don't have the answer to those questions for you. But I know MA student of mine who would have those answers for you. And she provided me contact to Jonathan, and I contacted him, and yes, he was like shooting all this data and stats about nonviolent resistance and the impact from the hip, and gave me all the answers I was seeking. So I hope that here will not be much difference here, and he will be also able to answer all your questions that you have with regard to the role and impact of nonviolent resistance on building democracy and ensuring successful transition. During our exchanges, I quickly recognized the significance of his work to our field, and I was very excited then to hear that he stayed at the University of Denver to pursue his PhD with Erika Chenoweth under her supervision. And a couple of years later, he also applied to our PhD fellowship. That fellowship supported his field research in Zambia, in Brazil, in Nepal, as part of his important work on the role of nonviolent campaigns. And eventually, we together with him, we worked on his monograph titled "When Civil Resistance Succeeds: Building Democracy After Popular Nonviolent Uprisings," and the key findings he'll be talking about today with you. Just a couple of facts about Jonathan. He's right now a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Sociology and Political Science at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Norway. He works there on the project The Anatomy of Resistance Campaigns. He's also external associate to the Peace Research Institute Oslo. He supervised data collections for the major data sets that are used right now as part of the studies of nonviolent campaigns. One is NAFCO, Nonviolent and Violent Campaigns and Outcomes. That data set is hosted by University of Denver, and Social Conflict Analysis Database. He's working currently on the book examining the long-term impact of nonviolent campaigns. He received his PhD, as I said, from University of Denver this year. 4 years earlier, he received MA from the same university and BA in International Affairs from Gordon College in Massachusetts. He currently lives in Norway, Trondheim. This is on the kind of east coast of Norway, and besides his academic work, he enjoys road biking and camping and mountain climbing. So he couldn't be probably in a better place than Norway to do so and enjoy these fabulous outdoor activities there. I envy you, Jonathan, for those opportunities.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Maciej. You're far too kind. Thank you so much to Maciej, to Dr. Mahmoudi, to Dr. Beeman, and to Dr. Maciej for inviting me to be here. It's really a privilege to be able to talk to all of you today, to be able to share a relatively new project. As Maciej mentioned, this is sort of the first fruits of many years of dissertation research, and so it's exciting to finally be able to share with everyone. I don't know, I think, let me just get a sense of what the room is. So, how many of you guys are undergrads? Okay, good, all right. How many of you are interested at all in graduate school after you finish your undergrad? It's okay if you're not, I won't be offended. Wow, all right, that's a good number. Okay, so you will understand this when you work on your own dissertation. And I have some friends in the room, Brandon back there, and Jake, if you understand this. A dissertation is what I like to call a mind baby. It takes a long time. It takes a lot of pain and suffering in order to get it out. But at the end, you are incredibly proud of it. So I'm now sharing with all of you the first pictures of my mind baby, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to do so. I have a particular very structured lecture prepared, but because most of you guys are undergrads, I enjoy teaching undergrads as well. So I think I would mix it up throughout the lecture and throw out some questions, have some interaction. I hope that's okay. I hope you guys are on board with that. All right? Good? Okay. Cool. All right. So, when civil resistance succeeds, building democracy after popular nonviolent uprisings. Let me tell you a little bit about why I wanted to study this question. So this was a while ago for many of you, but for me, this is still an event that is incredibly fresh in my memory. 2011, the Arab Spring uprisings beginning in Tunisia, spreading through Egypt, and then throughout the rest of the Middle East, was this incredible moment of hope for political change. The Middle East, of course, according to many scholars of democracy, many scholars of political change, many scholars of nonviolent resistance, had been seen as a place that was uniquely resistant to positive political change. And the Arab Spring, these massive, largely peaceful protests that ousted long-standing dictators like Zine Abidine Ben Ali in Tunisia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, created this huge moment of hope that was going to change, that change was possible, and that it could be accomplished through primarily nonviolent means. But of course, as we all know, this incredible moment of hope didn't quite end up the way that everyone was hoping. There was, moments of increasing frustration in places like Egypt as political change stalled. And then finally, of course, in 2013, the Egyptian military under General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi overthrew Egypt's first democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, and in the immediate aftermath of that, massacred hundreds and possibly even thousands of peaceful protesters in Cairo's Rabaa Adliya Square. In the time since that massacre, General al-Sisi has become the president of Egypt and has consolidated an authoritarian regime which is in many ways even more autocratic, even more repressive than the government which was in place before the revolution. So what happened? how did we get from this incredible moment of hope in places like Egypt, in places like Yemen, to this reversion to authoritarianism? And expanding it out beyond the specifics of the Arab Spring, why does nonviolent resistance, why do these moments of peaceful protest where ordinary people come together to try and achieve political change sometimes lead to democracy, sometimes lead to greater political representation, and sometimes not? In particular, I was very interested in this second question. What can we do about it? There's a lot of research out there about democracy, about what facilitates democracy in particular countries, what makes it more difficult. Things like a high level of economic development, a growing middle class, certain cultural factors, connections to other democratic countries. But if you were an activist, say in Egypt in 2012, or in places like Burkina Faso in 2015, or Guatemala, or any number of different countries that are going through transitions, going through a situation where they have ousted a dictator and want to know what to do next, telling them, well, your country really needs to be 5 times richer if you want democracy to really work. That's not really helpful. There's not really much you can do about that. So, what are the actual factors that political leaders, activists, and even people from the outside as well can affect in order to encourage democracy in these political transitions after nonviolent resistance? Okay. Before I get into the specifics of the research that I did, just a couple of terms to define in order to make sure we're all on the same page, all understanding each other. And again, because I haven't been teaching in a while, and so I'm eager to have some back and forth. So if I say nonviolent resistance, what does that mean to you? How would you define nonviolent resistance? Yeah.
Not physically harming the person or using any weapons.
Okay. Not physically harming someone and not using any weapons. Good. All right. What else? Yeah.
Not damaging property.
Not damaging property. Interesting. That's an area of debate in the literature as to whether that counts or not. Okay. What else? So right now I'm not harming anyone. I'm not using weapons or physical violence. Is what I'm doing right now nonviolent resistance? Yeah.
Well, you have to be resisting something or showing that you're against some policy or government or person.
There we go. Yeah, exactly. The nonviolent side here. You have to not be using physical violence, but you also have to be engaged in resistance. You have to be trying to accomplish something. You have to be in opposition to something. Good. Anything else we're missing so far? Stands out to anybody in the room? Yeah.
Using like a common source of communication, so like either social media or like protests to voice that resistance and then
Okay. Interesting. Tell me more. I'm not entirely sure I know what you mean.
like, I don't know, like if you're resisting something and other people are also wanting to resist that, you have to communicate with them. You're probably communicating either through like social media or like by gathering groups and protests.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. So yeah, communication, and I would perhaps put it slightly differently. I would say it has to be collective. Maybe not always. Maybe a single person might engage in an act of nonviolent resistance, but certainly in most circumstances, nonviolent resistance is going to be a collective action that's communicated amongst a broader population, not just something that individuals are doing. Here is how I sort of boil it down. If you read the monograph, I go ahead and talk about this at probably too much length. I think Maciej edited that section down a little bit, as I recall. The application of political force outside the normal avenues of politics and without the use or threat of physical violence. So as you brought up before, what's your name? Lucille. As Lucille very kindly brought up to start us off, in central part, without the use or threat of physical violence, the application of political force, so the resistance element, that's, what's your name?
Deborah.
That Deborah very kindly brought up. applying political force, so resistance to something out in the political realm. And then what I would bring up as well, this aspect of outside the normal avenues of politics. So nonviolent resistance is something that, at least how I talk about it, and how most people in the literature talk about it, is something that is distinct from just sort of day-to-day political action. So, for instance, writing to your congressman, which I hope is something all of you are doing early and often, is excellent. It's a very important form of political action, but would not necessarily be nonviolent resistance because it's within sort of the normal bounds of politics in the American political system. So these three key elements: political force, resistance to something in the realm of politics, outside the normal avenues, and without the use or threat of physical violence. Okay. Next up, next term that I'll sort of be referring to throughout the rest of my talk, what I call civil resistance transitions. Civil resistance, just a synonym for nonviolent resistance in this context, so you don't need to get hung up on that. Civil resistance transitions are political transitions that are initiated primarily by civil resistance, by nonviolent resistance. What's a political transition? When I say that, what does that mean to you? Yes.
It's kind of like how like different presidents go into office, so like that's a good political transition because people are coming to power.
Okay. Yeah. So different people coming to power. So one set of power holders exiting, and another set of power holders coming in. Okay. Anything else? All right. That's a good. And I would say I would put one slight difference in how I'm going to use that term here, in that beyond just a single set of power holders, when I talk about transitions, I'm talking about changes in broader political regimes. So, in the United States, of course, every either 4 or 8 years we have a new presidential administration come in, but our underlying political regime remains more or less the same. We have the same set of political institutions that are defining how people come into power, that are defining sort of the basic rules for how our political system operates. And so that kind of underlying structure remains the same, even though the specific people at the top may change. Whereas, of course, in many countries around the world, quite frequently we see changes in the underlying regime itself. That not just the personnel at the top of the political system, but indeed the whole political system itself can be transformed in its basic rules. So that sort of, that limits the population of things that we're looking at here. We're looking at situations in which not just a single set of power holders, but the underlying regime has been changed through nonviolent resistance. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to how many civil resistance transitions there have been around the world in the last, we'll say since World War II, so the last 70, 80 years? Yeah.
Through nonviolent means?
Through primarily, but perhaps not exclusively nonviolent means.
Maybe
A dozen, okay. That's a good guess. Other guesses? Higher. Yeah.
30?
Higher.
800?
800. Where did that come from?
Just
It was just higher. Not 800. Between 30 and 800. There have, in fact, since World War II, well, I would say specifically from 1945 through 2011, which is the period of time I looked at in this study, there have been 78 civil resistance transitions across 64 countries. The 64 countries which are in yellow here on this map, which, again, as you can see, this is all over the world. This is Europe. This is Africa. This is Latin America. Happening in several different waves of contention, from anti-colonial struggles beginning with Gandhi in the 1940s, going through the 1960s, to anti-authoritarian struggles in Latin America and Southern Europe in the 70s and 80s, Eastern Europe anti-communist struggles in the 80s and 90s, all the way through to the Arab Spring that I started with in 2011. So 78 transitions, so a fairly large population to examine. And so that's what I set out to do in this particular research project. So one part of it, and actually something I won't be emphasizing as much in this talk, but will come up a little bit, I did some detailed statistical analysis of these 78 transitions, both comparing them to all other regime transitions that have taken place during that time, which is closer to the 800 number. And then also looking within this population of 78 transitions to see what were the common factors that tended to lead to more or less democracy. So that's sort of step one, analyzing the whole population using quantitative methods. And then, as Maciej brought up at the beginning, I also examined three what I call most different cases. So basically 3 civil resistance transitions that had very different contextual factors to look at what the underlying commonalities were. Where could I find sort of common themes, common trends, common challenges across these cases? So those 2 cases, Brazil's transition away from military rule in 1984, Zambia's transition away from single-party authoritarian rule in 1991, and Nepal's transition away from monarchy in 2006. And I'll be weaving in sort of stories and lessons from these particular transitions as the talk goes on. But before I get to that, underlying factor. If you look at this population of 78 transitions, particularly if you compare them to all other transitions during the same period, you find pretty unequivocally that nonviolent resistance has a very strong democratizing impact. Would anyone care to hazard a guess as to how many of those 78 transitions ended in democracy? Yeah. 35. Good guess. Good guess. It's more than 35. Yeah. 70. Close. It's 60. 60 out of the 78 civil resistance transitions from 1945 to 2011 ended with at least a minimal form of democracy, which means basically that there was an elected executive. The executive power in the country comes into power through some form of elections, and those elections are at least minimally free and fair. There is some degree of real competition. So these aren't all, perfect, wonderful democratic regimes that don't have any problems, like Norway, where I happen to live now. But all sort of across what I call the democratic threshold. And this is a much higher proportion than any other form of transition. So if you look at transitions that have been initiated through sort of top-down moves by power holders, through external intervention by other actors, and probably most prominently transitions initiated by violent revolutions, these do not tend to end in democracy. It's very small proportions of those transitions that end in democracy. And this is the case even if you look at very unfavorable circumstances for democracy to emerge. So I think those words are probably too small for you guys to actually see them. But basically what this graph here is breaking apart all of the political transitions from 1945 through 2011 based on whether they were civil resistance transitions, with the civil resistance ones in blue and the non-civil resistance ones in yellow, and what percentage of those ended in democracy based on how repressive, how authoritarian, how undemocratic the previous regime was. And these are the worst cases right here. This is the worst of the worst. In the worst of the worst, if your transition was initiated by something other than nonviolent resistance, you ended up getting a democracy about 20% of the time. If it was initiated by nonviolent resistance, then you ended up getting democracy around 80% of the time. So nonviolent resistance does emerge even in very unfavorable circumstances. And it has this superior democratizing effect over other forms of political transition, even in the worst cases, even in the worst of the worst. So, good news, right? That's nice. You guys all on board with that? Sounds good. But of course, that brings us back to this puzzle from the beginning. If this is the case, if indeed we have this, this very positive impact from nonviolent resistance, why do we not see this happening in very prominent cases like Egypt, like the one that I started with? And so in the monograph, based on the research, I focus on two particular challenges that happen in these kinds of political transitions. Two particular consistent barriers that countries face when they are going through a civil resistance transition. And I think it's important to say as well, these are not meant to be exclusive. I'm not saying these are the only particular challenges, just that these are ones that we see consistently across civil resistance transitions in many different circumstances. The first is what I call maintaining mobilization. So of course, nonviolent resistance involves a lot of people coming together in order to achieve major political changes. Lots of people hitting the streets, lots of people engaged in political action. But oftentimes, once the old guy is gone, once the dictator is out, once political change has actually been initiated, people tend to go home. Because it's just a quirk of human psychology that we tend to be motivated more by what we hate than what we love and what we want to see in the future. So maintaining mobilization to sort of keep new political elites accountable during a period of transition is a consistent challenge that we see across civil resistance transitions. And the second challenge is in some ways kind of the mirror image of the first one. And it is to avoid what in the monograph I call street radicalism. Now, basically what this is when the tools of nonviolent resistance are used not to build a new political order in this time of transition, but rather to prevent any new political order from actually coming into being. Where particular political or social groups will use the tools of nonviolent resistance for their own short-term ends. And so anytime a new set of political norms, a new set of political institutions is being built, that gets torn down by those who don't find it in their short-term advantage to see that particular arrangement. And so if your country during its time of transition has high levels of mobilization and low levels of street radicalism, I argue you are quite likely to end in democracy. If you have the opposite, low levels of mobilization or high levels of street radicalism or both, then you are unlikely to end in democracy. I'm not going to go into all of the ways in which I look at this statistically. Happy to talk about that for those who are interested in Q&A time. But just to briefly illustrate this here, the dots on the graph there are the 78 civil resistance transitions that I showed you on the map before. Graphed based on their level of transitional mobilization here on the vertical axis, their level of street radicalism here along the horizontal axis, and then distinguished by color based on whether they ended in democracy or non-democracy. The democracies, the yellow dots, as you can see, clustered here on the top left side, so indicating high mobilization and low street radicalism, and the non-democracies, indicated by the blue dots, clustered in the bottom right, indicating high street radicalism and low mobilization. And again, happy to talk about that in more detail and sort of what kinds of empirical measures I use if you guys are interested. But for now, I'll move on with that. So, important to have high mobilization, important to have low street radicalism. But then the question becomes, how do we actually do that? How do we actually go about accomplishing that? If, again, say you're an activist who has been part of a movement that has overthrown a dictator, and you want to ensure that your country moves in a democratic direction. So for both of these, in the monograph, I highlight three particular lessons this group of transitions, and particularly the 3 transitions that I examined in depth and talked to activists and political leaders from, can tell us. So 3 lessons about maintaining mobilization, 3 lessons about avoiding street radicalism. And the first lesson on maintaining mobilization is to foster independent civic forces. So in times of political transition, after nonviolent resistance movements, there's often a very strong impetus for the groups from sort of civil society more broadly, that have been focused on advocating for democracy, advocating for political change, to simply enter the political sphere, to become political parties, to struggle directly for political power. This is all well and good. You need people to be struggling for political power in order to have a real democracy. But you also need forces that are outside of that political struggle, who can keep their primary allegiance to changing the political system itself, to keeping the transition on track in a democratic direction. And this is quite hard. There is a lot of pressure for these kinds of accountability groups to either enter the political system or to simply demobilize. As one of the civil society leaders in Nepal told me, we had said our movement will go on until the Constitution is framed, so this first couple of years after they had ousted the king of Nepal. And when that happened, our colleagues, political parties, civil society, NGOs, they all deserted us. And slowly, the whole entire civil society forces became status quo oriented. Our wings were clipped. So these independent movements that had been in place before to push for greater democratic change, to ensure the protection of human rights, etc., either became largely subsumed into political parties or they were pushed to demobilize. That makes sense to everybody? You all tracking? Okay, good. Next lesson on maintaining mobilization is to keep new leaders accountable. Who's the leader of a nonviolent movement that you guys can think of? It's okay to say the obvious answer. Martin Luther King. Great. That's a good one. And what do we think of Martin Luther King? Good guy or not so good guy? There we go. Yes. Good guy. Very good guy. What do we think of Gandhi? Good guy or not so good of a guy? Good guy? Everyone on board with Gandhi being a pretty good guy? Yeah, so nonviolent resistance movements are often led by figures that become almost mythologized in their own time. This is certainly the case for very prominent nonviolent resistance movement leaders like Martin Luther King and Gandhi, who have global reach in their impact. But in particular countries that have gone through civil resistance transitions, you have similar figures. These figures go through very difficult times. They suffer tremendous costs, go through tremendous sacrifices in order to achieve positive political change. And that gives them a certain credibility, a certain trust. People think that if this person enters political power, they're not going to be like the people who were there before, because they're different. Because we can admire them, we can look up to them, we can see sort of the struggle that they went through in order to get where they ended up. And this, sadly, is often not the case. What's the thing we all know about power? What does power do to you? There we go. Power corrupts. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so I bring you Zambian President Frederick Chiluba, who is perhaps one of the best examples of this process in action. So Frederick Chiluba started his career as a trade union activist. He was first a worker and then the leader of the Zambian Congress of Trade Unions in the 1970s and 1980s. And in that role, he suffered tremendously in order to achieve democratic change in his country. He spearheaded several campaigns pushing against Zambia's single-party authoritarian government. He went to prison several times. He turned down opportunities to join the non-democratic government because he said it was wrong, because he believed in democracy. And so, when the late 1980s, early 1990s rolled around, change was in the air around the world, including in Zambia, Frederick Chiluba became a leader in Zambia's movement for multi-party democracy, a nonviolent resistance movement that successfully ousted that country's non-democratic government and initiated a period of democratic change. Chiluba, in fact, became such a prominent leader that he was the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy's presidential candidate and was Zambia's first sort of truly democratically elected president in 1991. And no sooner had he moved through the doors of Zambia's state house in Lusaka than immediately he started taking advantages of the purposes of his office in order to enrich himself, in order to benefit people from his family, and his particular community, and started suppressing political opposition. If you ask just about any Zambian political leader or activist from this period, they all remember this one moment where, a couple of months after entering office, Chiluba said that he never knew that power could be so sweet. Which, how on the nose can you be? As a result, many, Zambia's democratic progress stalled because, again, people had faith that Chiluba was this leader who wouldn't go down this road, that he was someone who could be trusted with significant amounts of power because of what he had gone through in order to achieve it. But the result was a huge increase in political corruption and suppression of political opposition. This is the Political Corruption Index from the Varieties of Democracy Project from Zambia from 1980 to 2010. This period right here between the yellow lines is Frederick Chiluba's presidency, which, as you can see, as soon as he comes into office, political corruption basically doubles and maintains at a very high level during his time in office. So no matter how inspiring your leader may be when he or she is out of power, once in power, significant corruption can set in, and so it is important that ordinary people maintain a skeptical, a critical eye towards their new leaders. Okay. Third lesson on maintaining mobilization: maintain a democratic vision. As I brought up before, nonviolent resistance movements in non-democracies are often motivated by what people want to change. Probably the most famous motto of the Arab Spring uprisings was "the people want the downfall of the regime." Powerful message. You can unite around it. People with lots of different visions of what the future looked like can all agree to join forces on the streets because they don't like how things are right at the moment. But the problem is, a lot of things have to happen after the old regime goes. After the dictator steps down, there are a lot of steps before your political transition can actually end in a new democracy. And so if your movement has been motivated by a purely negative vision, by a vision purely based around ousting a dictator, then there aren't many reasons for people to remain mobilized once the dictator is gone. And so it's important to have this longer-term democratic vision of the future. And in this regard, activists in Brazil in the 1980s are actually a very positive example of this at work. So Brazil, in large part through a nonviolent resistance movement, ousted its military dictatorship in 1984, initiated a period of political transition. But Brazilian activists were very explicit from the beginning, even before the military regime was ousted, that getting rid of the military dictatorship was only a means to an end. That the end was a deeper transformation of society. That what they wanted was an end to inequality. What they wanted was a different economic model. What they wanted were greater protections for underprivileged groups in society. They didn't just want the military gone. They wanted the military gone so they could accomplish the deeper things that they had in mind. As a quote from a Brazilian political scientist, Popular movements believed that organized efforts should be arranged in order to avoid the demobilizing effects of the transition to transaction and to maximize the prospects of making a break with the past. Aspirations for a more just society could only be achieved if popular pressure and participation were exercised. So, 3 ways of maintaining mobilization. 3 ways of maintaining mobilization: maintain a democratic vision, keep your leaders accountable, and foster independent civic forces. So, street radicalism. First, avoid extreme protest tactics. So, as I brought up before, of course, nonviolent resistance gets its power in large part because it can disrupt, because it can prevent ordinary methods of social, political, and economic control from operating. And in that, and because of that power, it can, of course, be an incredibly potent force for ending political oppression. But, of course, beyond that, it can also be these sorts of extreme tactics, these disruptive tactics, can be used for more short-term goals and cause significant disruption to ordinary people's lives. And in the context of a political transition, this can often backfire against the creation of democratic institutions and create a sense of longing, a sense of desire to go back to the way that things were back in the non-democratic past. And Nepal is a very good example of these dynamics at work. Since a nonviolent resistance movement ousted that country's king in 2006, Nepal's various political parties and social and ethnic groups have engaged in an almost perpetual back and forth of sort of the most extreme disruptive nonviolent resistance tactics, to the extent of, for instance, blockading the country's trade routes with India, which means that crucial supplies like food and fuel can't get into the country. Or, for instance, general strikes, so completely shutting down a particular town, district, or even in some cases the entire country in order to achieve a particular political end. And this has had very extreme negative economic consequences in particular. This is from an analysis by a couple of economists at Nepal's central bank that looked at the number of general strikes in Nepal from 2008 through 2012, and saw that the effect of the strikes was to lower GDP growth from around 0.6% to around 2.2% per year over this period, which is quite significant. The effect on ordinary people has, as I mentioned before, been a widespread disillusionment with democracy. People say, we thought that things were going to change once we could actually vote for our leaders, once we actually had representative political institutions. But what we see instead is that there's just this perpetual disruption, this perpetual instability, and we can't actually get on with our lives. To the point that when I was in Nepal interviewing some of the leading activists who had been involved in this movement in 2006 against the king, they said we made a mistake. We should have kept the king. We should have kept the king in power, or at the very least, we should have him come back and rule the country as an autocrat, as a dictator for about 10 years or so, until we can kind of get things back under control. So democracy becomes very unstable when these kinds of extreme protest tactics are a perpetual resort for political forces. Next lesson on preventing street radicalism: supporting new institutions. So as I mentioned, of course, mobilization is important. People need to stay engaged in the transition process, but that mobilization needs to be directed, or will be most productive if directed towards building new institutional structures and making sure that those institutional structures are democratic and representative. And Brazil is another good example here. As I mentioned, primarily a nonviolent resistance movement ousted that country's military dictatorship in 1984. They maintained a lot of social and political mobilization, but much of that became focused on affecting the shape of Brazil's new constitution, which was passed in 1988. So popular movements like the labor movement, women's rights movement, etc., for instance, proposed 122 popular amendments to the Constitution, which, through their pressure, ended up with a lot of particular progressive protections. For instance, a constitutionally protected right to strike, universal health care through Brazil's unified health system, and constitutional protections for the expropriation of unproductive land, which is a way of fighting against economic inequality. All right. Third lesson on preventing radicalism. Don't shut everyone from the old regime out. Now, a major impetus in many of these transitions, of course, is to get rid of hated figures from an oppressive government. And of course, it's important. Accountability to, say, standards of human rights protections are incredibly important to establish a democratic government. But of course, in some cases, what this ends up being is not so much about principles of protecting human rights and maintaining accountability for the sins of the past, but becomes more about political vindictiveness for long-term rivals. And if this happens, if basically anyone who was a part of the old government before the transition began is simply excluded from the possibility of political power, of engagement with the political system, then what ends up happening is the creation of a potent force that has no interest in maintaining democracy and indeed seeks to undermine it at every turn. And a good example of this comes again from Zambia. This man here is Kenneth Kaunda, who was the first president of Zambia and the president of Zambia during its period of non-democracy, during its period of single-party authoritarian rule. Kaunda, of course, as I mentioned before, defeated in the 1991 election by the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy and Frederick Chiluba. But a few years later, Kaunda expressed an interest and began re-engaging with politics in the new democratic Zambia, and from all indications did so in good faith. That he was actually he wasn't interested in a return to authoritarianism. That he simply wanted to participate in the democratic political system. However, the new government would have none of this. They were afraid of him. They had a great deal of resentment towards him and his political party because of the past, and so initially began using government resources to shut him out from political competition. For instance, by shutting down his party's rallies, and indeed ended up passing a constitutional amendment, which, while not explicitly naming him, basically had the effect solely of barring Kaunda as an individual from running for president. The effect of this was that Kaunda's political party lost faith in democracy and began planning a way to undermine the new democratic political system through what they called the zero option plan. Basically a plan to facilitate a maximum level of political instability and violence around the country so that people would lose faith in the new democratic regime and then stage a takeover. When this was found out by the government of Zambia, they declared a state of emergency, rolled back many civil liberties and human rights protections, and initiated a pattern of politics where Zambia, up until today, focuses more or less on all or nothing anti-democratic struggles. So, 3 lessons on preventing radicalism: don't shut everyone out, support new institutions, and avoid these extreme tactics. That is the core of what I talk about in the course of the monograph. Core lessons on these particular topics. Just a little bit at the very end about what can we do. So, for people who are outside of these situations, none of us are going through a civil resistance transition right now. What is our role? How can we be helpful if we want to encourage democracy in these situations? The first is to not think too highly of ourselves and to honor local autonomy in these particular situations. Independent civic forces, like I was talking about before, to be credible, need independence from local political parties. They also need independence from international parties. There needs to be a greater connection between local activists and their local populations, rather than with the international community writ large. So we need to listen to local actors, to local activists, political leaders, see what their needs are, what the needs of their constituencies are, and not try and make them fit into our particular cookie cutter mold. As one Nepali leader related to me, many human rights organizations, they were not movements, they were not inspired internally because they're NGOs, foreign supported. Some donors like to talk about being a movement, but hell, that's an oxymoron. Donors and movements don't go together. I would say perhaps not so extremely. I think they can go together in some circumstances, but I think the point remains. We have to honor the greater knowledge of particular situations that activists within these countries have. However, I do think that there's a role for external actors in fostering this kind of long-term strategic thinking, helping movements, activists, and political leaders in these countries to think about these lessons from other contexts, to expose them to the ideas and experiences of activists who have gone through, who walked down this road before, and to enrich their own thinking. And finally, something that came up quite consistently in many different circumstances in Nepal, Zambia, Brazil, and elsewhere, is the importance of consistent principled advocacy. People in many of these countries are skeptical of international support, particularly Western support, because it seems so clearly self-interested. It seems so clearly based not on a particular allegiance to, say, principles of universal human rights, or real advocacy for democracy, but rather for short-term geopolitical gain. And that advocacy for democracy and human rights is simply a smokescreen for that. However, in situations where international actors were indeed truly principled, truly focused on these underlying principles, rather than simply using them as tools for advancing their particular foreign policy agendas, that was very useful in getting protection and increasing visibility for particular activists. So, nonviolent resistance is a powerful democratizing force, but this isn't automatic. If we want democracy in situations of civil resistance transitions, we need to continue to mobilize and to direct that mobilization away from street radicalism and into new institutions. And with that, thank you so much for your attention, and we look forward to discussion.
We have a few minutes for questions, so this is a good time to please ask your questions.
Yeah.
I know you said you go over your methodology with us at your time. I don't know if you could brief overview about
Okay. So for each, specifically about mobilization and street radicalism, and that was the specific circumstance in which I had brought it up. Is that what you're curious about? Okay. So basically for those cases, I collected several different indicators that I thought were plausible proxies for high levels of mobilization or high levels of street radicalism. So in the case of mobilization, it was things like the numbers of protests and strikes in a particular year, indicators of civil society organization, density and activity, and levels of public engagement in the policymaking process. I then used factor analysis, which is a way of sort of getting the underlying dimensions of several different indicators and aggregating them into a single variable to create what I argued is a plausible proxy for the underlying dimension of mobilization. And then those are the variables that I used to define mobilization and street radicalism. Is that helpful? Great. Yes.
Did you notice that it was harder to maintain democracy in countries that were more religiously or ethnically diverse?
No. That's it's interesting. There is a literature that has looked at that. People tend to find that diversity on its own is not really a very consistent predictor of higher or lower levels of democracy, or even of conflict in general. Basically because there's a lot of diversity out there, and conflict in democratic transitions are quite rare. So no, I do have. I mean, I have run some of those models because it's a discussion in literature, but no, they're not a particularly strong predictor. Yeah.
Did you find anything on the role religious groups played in mobilizing civil resistance?
Not in this project, but in the project that I'm working on right now. And yes, they play a very important role. I mean, I think our minds often very quickly go to people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, like we were talking about before. In a separate project that I'm working on right now, we found that in part when religious organizations participate in nonviolent resistance movements, that helps the democratization process afterwards, makes the democratization process much more robust. We argue because these organizations have a reason to continue to be around and to maintain their independence after the old regime is ousted. If you're a church, a mosque, a synagogue, etc., you still have a reason to be around. But you have this experience organizing and mobilizing that can be easily reactivated if there is a move away from democracy. Yeah, good question. Yeah, Jacob.
So I have a question about the role that armed wings play.
Yes.
Well, I guess my question is, what role do armed wings play in your dependent variable? The likelihood of.
Right. I mean, I would say not a robust one.
Okay.
At least I didn't find kind of including, say, like a radical, the radical flank variable from NAPCO.
Right.
Including that does not either make the effect of mobilization or street radicalism go away, and it is not itself a robust predictor. As far as like specific cases, I think there is evidence that it is deleterious. So for instance, in Nepal, of course, one of the parties in the movement that overthrew the king in 2006 was the Maoist rebel movement that, of course, had previously been an armed insurgency, but then they gave up violent struggle because it was failing and joined a larger coalition in order to achieve political change. And they ostensibly demobilized during the transitional period, but still had a pretty robust, they called it the Young Communist League. They're like, no, these aren't soldiers, they're just youths. And the youths happen to be out there with clubs and knives and guns, but they're not an armed group, don't worry about it. And they were used pretty consistently in a anti-democratic fashion in these kinds of extreme protest tactics in Nepal that I was talking about. So I think it facilitates that kind of action if you have, for instance, people who can enforce a general strike with clubs and knives and guns.
Other questions? Dr. Pickney, we really appreciate your presenting such interesting results of a very important study on a very important topic. And for our appreciation, we just have a small token gift to